Welcome, everyone. Bienvenue à tous. Welcome back to the Policies for Better Lives Conference. So I would like to begin by acknowledging the Indigenous peoples of all the lands that we are on today, from wherever we are at this moment. In Canada, from coast to coast, we acknowledge the ancestral and unceded territory of all the Inuit, Métis, and First Nations people that call this land home. The Kuniekehaka Nation are the traditional custodians of the lands and waters from which those of us in Montreal are joining today. I'd like to recognize that any effort to conceive of new and better policy must first acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past, and that reconciliation and collaboration are up to each of us as well as to all of us. So, welcome to this second week of our 4-week conference. As you all know, last week we had our opening panel. Hopefully, through attending or watching the recording, you all feel a little bit familiar with the evidence base behind the modern science of subjective well-being and how it is starting to be reflected in policy. By asking people how life feels overall, governments can now build up knowledge about what really matters for a high quality of life. Today, we're in one of 4 two-hour sessions. And as you know, there were 2 running from 10 to 11:50, and now we're in the 2 from 12 to 2 Montreal time. This one, as you know, is focused on how policy might change lives for the better through initiatives supporting urban life and community. So the session will start with us all viewing a series of short videos by a number of top researchers studying the determinants of life satisfaction. We asked each of them the following question, okay, and asking them to prepare a video. What would be your dream government policy for improving well-being based on the available evidence? And ask them that it should be specific, actionable, clearly supported by the evidence, and not a current policy priority. So after we view all the videos, 3 policy and practice leaders will comment on the feasibility of each policy in the Canadian context. Would this make sense in Canada? Would there be enough political support? Is this cost effective? Then we'll have a good discussion among the panelists and with all of you about the proposed policies and explore other policy ideas for Canada. So let me just tell you one thing about the premise of today's session before I turn things over to our esteemed moderator. A tide has turned in the last few years among happiness researchers. The change is that we're now ready to move beyond the research, beyond applying that research in our narrow circles and lives to what we call well-being, quality of life, policy making, and budgeting. This means actually acting with public policy, changing what government does and where it spends our collective resources, all with an eye to making better lives. So the goal of today's session is to explore what policies, start exploring ideas on what policies we could really be putting into action now or in the near future, how good the evidence is for them, and how feasible they are in the Canadian context. So I'll pass it on now to our panel moderator. Mais juste avant, un petit mot pour dire que les présentations vont tous être faites en anglais, mais les commentaires et questions sont les très bienvenus en français. So now I'd just like to introduce Val Morrison. She's scientific advisor at the National Collaborating Center for Healthy Public Policy. Much of her work is focused on policy approaches and wicked problems to reducing health inequalities. And we're very thankful that Val was able to join us today as moderator. Val, it's over to you.
Thanks, Jennifer, and thank you again to Jennifer and to Chris as well for inviting me to participate in the conference in what's been a super interesting so far conference, and I'm looking forward to hearing that continue with this session. So this is the session on urban life and community, and Jennifer has told you how it will be structured, so I won't repeat that. What I will do is introduce first our 3 researchers, as well as the 3 responders. I'll give you their names now, but we'll start with the short videos as we did in the last session. So the presentations will come from Stefano Bartolini, who is a professor of happiness, economics, and political economy at the University of Siena. And that will be followed by a presentation by Paul Frijters, a professor of well-being economics at the London School of Economics. And finally, Professor Alex Haslam, who is professor of social and organizational psychology and Australian Laureate Fellow at the University of Queensland. So those will be the 3 video presentations that we will see, and they will be followed with responses by Susan Holdsworth, who is project manager for Recover Urban Wellbeing, Keren Tang, who is participatory city development manager at the J.W. McConnell Foundation, and by Gaynor Watson-Creed, who is Assistant Dean Serving and Engaging Society in the Faculty of Medicine at Dalhousie University, and is also chair of the board of Engage Nova Scotia. So without further ado, we can cue up the videos and we'll see you back here later for discussion.
The central question of my talk is, are there social changes that can lead to happier and more sustainable lives? Some ecologists answer negatively. According to them, to achieve sustainability entails that current generations should sacrifice their standard of living and therefore their happiness. Their claim is that there is a trade-off between happiness and sustainability. I would check whether this answer is correct by analyzing cities. Cities are crucial for the answer because most people in the world live in cities and most pollution, resource consumption comes from cities. So my question is it possible to organize cities in such a way to live more happily and sustainably? Is the recipe for happy cities different from the recipe for sustainable cities? Let's compare the features of sustainable and happy cities to check whether they look alike. How is a sustainable city made? Let's focus on Copenhagen, the capital of Denmark, a famous example of ambitious sustainability goals. Copenhagen wants to reach carbon neutrality within 2025, and it is rapidly approaching to this target. How? Their strategy have 2 pillars. First, to reduce the need for urban mobility. Copenhagen is filling up with all neighborhoods with points of interest, such as post offices, sports facilities, bars, restaurants, libraries, shops, green spaces, etc. Green spaces in particular play a critical role in this strategy. Copenhagen has been filled with pocket gardens. You can see one in the picture. They are typically very small, and they are created in unused urban spaces such as street corners, small spaces between houses, and small neighborhood squares. And the second pillar is the revolution in mobility. The use of cars has been severely restricted. Mobility works on bike or public transportation. Public transportation has become very efficient. Bikes have been promoted in all ways. The city has a huge infrastructure for bikes. It's plenty of parkings. There are biking bridges. You can see one in the picture. In this way, Copenhagen is greatly cutting carbon emissions, rapidly approaching to carbon neutrality. Let's now see the features of a happy city. Cities have been invented 5,000 years ago, and their function has always been the aggregation of people, building relationships. Relationships were created in urban common spaces. Then cars arrived a few decades ago, and the common space lost quality and lost its function to create relationships. Cars are dangerous for pedestrians, and they are invasive. They invade lungs, ears, sidewalks, beyond the streets. The decline of the urban social fabric that followed from car domination is a big issue for happiness. Happiness studies show that social relationships are critical to happiness. The situation harms everyone, but in particular the youngsters and the elderly. For their reduced mobility, their society hangs on the availability of a social fabric just outside their home door, but cars hamper this possibility. Over the past decades, there has been a revolution in the life of young and old people. Until a few decades ago, they lived in a dense network of relationships. Now 80% of under 18 years old and 40% of over 65 report feeling lonely. Children used to spend most of their free time together and outdoors. Now, for the first time in history, children's time is spent primarily at home in front of a screen rather than among other children. Car domination contributed to this change, shaping a lonely life for kids. All in all, the literature on these topics suggests that shifting from a car-based urban mobility to a mobility based on bikes, public transport, and sharing would substantially improve the quality of common space, resulting in increased sociability and happiness. Another crucial role for happiness is played by green spaces. Dozens of studies emphasize the benefits of green space. It promotes mental health and physical health, sociability, recovery from mental fatigue and stress, and even students' academic performance. It is another widely studied topic. More walkable and less car-dominated neighborhoods promote social connections and happiness. Walkable neighborhoods are densely populated and mixed use. Mixed use means multiple functions: residential, commercial, recreational, work. This translates into more interest points, which in turn means more people in the streets and more social connections. What does not work are the typical American suburbs, where population density is low, people are car dependent, and there are only houses. Summarizing, the features of a happy city include high residential density, mixed use, pedestrian areas, green space, sports centers, walkability, and a revolution in mobility based on public transport, cycling, and sharing. Another advantage of the kind of city I'm suggesting is that it would reduce spending on healthcare. Epidemiological studies show that poor relationships and unhappiness are major risk factors for physical and mental health. This has implications for prevention, which should take place outside the healthcare systems. Improving happiness and relationships substantially reduce morbidity and thus spending on healthcare. This prevention may be particularly effective when targeting the elderly, the big burden on healthcare spending. You see here the impact of social isolation on the elderly's health is to increase the risk of most typical diseases of the old age. Numbers in these epidemiological studies are big. Good relationships substantially reduce the risk of diseases, and we expect a substantial reduction in spending on healthcare as well. So let's go to my take-home message. There is no trade-off between happiness and sustainability, at least as far as cities are concerned. The reason is that the features of a happy city and of a sustainable city overlap almost perfectly. Urban planning for sociability, happiness, and sustainability of both the environment and healthcare spending can be effective and low cost. The key is reforming the space and the use of space and mobility. Many thanks for your attention.
Good afternoon from London. I want to tell you about a plan in order to improve well-being in a very cost-effective way once these nasty lockdowns have been over. As we know, the lockdowns have caused an awful lot of misery, loneliness, mental health problems, particularly amongst those people who had to sit at home and not see and touch their loved ones for almost a year now in much of the Western world and Canada. So the question is then, how can we restart community life? Because we know in the wellbeing literature that community life is really the thing that matters most to people. This is a finding that comes up again and again and again in the World Happiness Report and in many other publications. And the idea I have for you really comes out of the natural lottery programs in the UK from about 5 years ago, where they posed a similar question. They wanted to, in a cost-effective way, have as much well-being in the UK as possible. And really what they thought of and what they latched onto was the oldest of group activities we really have as humans, which is to make food together. We are an incredibly social animal. We evolved in groups of maybe 30 to 100. And the key thing we all did together in those early days was have food together, prepare food together, in which lots of people had different roles in terms of getting different types of food, but also preparing the food, sharing it around, and then cleaning up. And the basic idea in order to kickstart well-being again after the lockdowns is to take a leaf out of that ancient human booklet and do this on a grand scale. So what happened in the UK natural lottery programs was that all over the United Kingdom, there were lots of volunteer groups who each had their own sort of special thing that they wanted to do with food, particular types of food or particular preparation methods, and they used the community facilities that were there. They could be the RSPCA offices, they could be Scouts offices, they could be community centres, they could be churches, but minimally they had a kitchen and a large table in which everybody in the community living close by could join in. This was heavily advertised, lots of people came, you had volunteers, and the idea was that everybody was involved in terms of preparing the meals, setting the table, doing the dishes, but lots of people, of course, would have had different roles in doing that preparation. And the great thing about preparing food is that this is a universal human habit. We do this from a very early age. We can all have a particular role. Some of us like some things and not other things. Some people don't mind the washing up. Other people hate doing the potatoes. But everybody is used to taking a role in food preparation. And of course, food preparation itself is a pro-community activity. One makes the food for a community. And the great thing that they found in the UK and that they found all over the world really is that as people prepare the meal together and learn how to either cook an egg or a souffle, if they're trying to be very sophisticated, is that they start talking about their lives and they form friendships, they form communities, they arise out of the interaction. So then later on, people exchange emails, they exchange Facebook profiles, they start up new groups and they start to do all kinds of other things together, maybe walk around the community, maybe shared interests in art or poetry. Now, the National Lottery in the UK evaluated a lot of these programs, and there were lots of different ones. But what they found was that for an investment of maybe £100, they got about half a Wellbeing for half a year in the participants. Now, a Wellbeing is one unit of life satisfaction on a 0 to 10 scale for one person for 1 year. And this is the main measure with which we now look at the cost effectiveness of lots of programs around the world. So if you get a quarter of a Wellbeing, which is half a Wellbeing for half a year, for £100, you get a whole Wellbeing for £400, which is about 700 Canadian dollars. Now that is much, much cheaper than the amount that you'd have to pay via, let's say, health services or normal mental health services or social services or police or education facilities. It's an order of magnitude cheaper, easily 5 to 10 times cheaper than those other ways in which you can improve the well-being of your population. So you're getting a huge bang for the buck. And this is also very easy to prepare beforehand. So the Canadian government can now already put all those community organizations interested in food programs on steroids, say, hey, as soon as we're done with the lockdowns, we want you guys to get everybody in the community together around these food preparation programs. Put in your plans. We want you to sort of do this for hundreds of communities, already start training the volunteers, which of course you can do online. And figure out how you can get people to these venues and back and basically get all the organization going. And this is what I would advocate you to do in Canada as soon as the lockdowns lift, and I would advocate everybody in the Western world to do this.
Hello, Chris, and hello, everybody at your conference at McGill on public policy. A big hello from Brisbane in Australia. I'm sorry that I can't be there, but I've made this short video to speak to your key task, which was to think about, identify and develop the one policy that you would implement in the domain of public health to improve health and well-being. And the answer, very straightforwardly from me, is group-targeted social prescribing. Why is that important? Well, because that's been proven to deal with a range of problems which present in health context, notably at GP surgeries, and in particular, problems associated with loneliness and social disconnection. The evidence is that loneliness and social disconnection is growing, and it represents a more potent threat to mortality than a range of really well-known counterindicators for health. Things like lack of exercise, drinking, poor diet, and it's roughly equivalent to smoking 15 cigarettes a day. But we also know that if people are encouraged to join meaningful social groups, then that can have a significant effect in staving off loneliness. For example, if when you retire, you lose 2 group memberships, your risk of dying in the next 6 years is 12.1%. If you join or gain 2 group memberships, it's 0.41%. If you've been depressed in the past and you don't join any groups, the chances of relapse is 41%. If you join 2 groups, it's half that, 21%. We know too that people who are struggling with loneliness visit a GP surgery on average 3.74 times in 3 months. But if they join one meaningful social group, that drops to 2.28 times. So interventions that help people to make meaningful connections, deal with this crippling health problem. Implement the policy of choice here from an evidence-based perspective is one that we've developed actually in conjunction with colleagues in Canada, called Groups for Health. And Groups for Health, which effectively brings people into a range of community contexts and helps them to source meaningful groups and then provides scaffolding for them to then live out those group memberships, is one of the few interventions that's been shown to have targeted impact on loneliness. It also, incidentally, is very effective in dealing with depression and social anxiety. It's as effective as the kind of gold standard treatment, which is cognitive behavior therapy. So in targeting loneliness, you can actually target a range of health conditions in this way. But also, I would argue, you deal with a range of social problems which hang around loneliness and which are toxic in the most extreme degree. So Groups for Health, targeted social prescribing, is a policy I think that every country would benefit from. And there's evidence now of uptake of that in the UK, in Australia, and I think the time is ripe for that kind of science-informed implementation around the world, but not least in Canada, of course, because it fits too with much of the work that we have done in the past with colleagues in that space through our connections to the Canadian Institute for Advanced Research. So there it is. I'm happy to talk more about it, but again, I think this is something we really need to identify and hit hard.
Well, thank you for those very interesting and informative propositions of policies and areas where we need to focus our efforts. We'll turn now to the responders and ask them for feedback on what we've just heard. And we'll start with Susan Holdsworth.
Thank you. I'm joining you from Treaty 6 territory, Miskwichi Waskahegan, and I'm on this panel because of my role with Recover Urban Wellbeing, a City of Edmonton initiative. And it started with concerns related to homelessness and the concentration of social services in our core. Since 2017, we've been on a journey to uncover what well-being in our city really means and what it takes to achieve it. And we've done this through deep ethnographic research and exploration of well-being from multiple perspectives, including Indigenous, Eastern, and Western, and through our experience prototyping a whole bunch of ideas. And we've learned that well-being is about connection, both within and beyond self. So feel free to check out our well-being framework. It includes target outcomes, and tools for change on our website, urbanwellnessedmonton.com, and there's also a bunch of other resources there. And keep your eyes open for info on our evaluation prototypes coming up this summer. We've abandoned our original indicators, and we're going to be measuring well-being through stories and creating a visual dashboard. So now to the feasibility of the policies based on the ideas. I want to go over 3 challenges. There are many more, like politics, but I'm going to talk about culture, inclusion, and reciprocity. So in terms of culture, I mean, there's so many: car culture, polarization, business thinking. There's a lot of, I want to talk about presets, how we tend to do things. For example, there's a tendency in government and institutions to lean on solutions focused on increasing efficiency, coordination, minimizing risk. These business management approaches that are so deeply ingrained are likely to get in the way of policy implementation. In terms of our general culture, I want to talk about 3 presets, unconscious tendencies that pose challenges. The first is the how we talk about community life and people living in the margins. The language we use, it tends to be deficit-based. It's about needs, disorder, vulnerability. It's not asset-based. There's no nod on gifts, resources, resilience. It's polarizing language, and we need to change our language and change the narratives. The second how is how we frame problems. So we tend to be focused on basic or material needs, not being holistic enough, not giving enough recognition for higher order needs like purpose, respect, and connection. And related to this is how we frame outcomes. For example, we often focus on food or shelter as the goal of a policy, but they're really the means to higher end, like connection. And when we confuse ends and means, we risk supplying the means in a way that can inadvertently cause further harm. So I did love the idea of food as a means to community connection. The third how is how we tend to express knowledge, with rational, verifiable data. How do we deal with the subjectives that everyone brings to well-being work? How do we make more space for experiential knowledge or Indigenous ways of knowing? It's a challenge to design a well-being policy that doesn't fall into any of the above presets, doesn't perpetuate colonial ways of thinking and making meaning. Changing all these hows is super hard. In terms of inclusion, when refocusing well-being to emphasize connections and relationships, the specific challenge is to include everyone. The even more specific challenge is how to broker people in from the margins to the center of community life. How do we integrate contributions of people who are typically pushed out? How do we help people navigate tensions, to deal with their discomfort? Help them to learn that experiencing tensions shouldn't stop them from connecting with each other. How to practice new behaviors. With Recover, we're experimenting with this, trying to figure out what works for whom. And there's research out there that shows that activities around parenting or social justice are good ways. Maybe the social prescribing could have a dose of those, but you have to be constantly resisting the pressure to push people out to the margins again. And the last challenge I'd like to talk about is reciprocity. A key problem with community life is the lack of healthy reciprocal relationships in and across communities. So how can a policy or a social prescription make you nurture these kinds of connections? Like, what's the social infrastructure for them? How can such a policy be meaningful or effective? It means moving beyond the charity model. It's about sharing and building new skills together, like cooking. And so how do you get people to have moments of authentic interaction? That's the crux. And this brings me to the need to flip policy upside down. Our current flow is to create new policy, which sets up the framework for programs, and which then affect people and communities. And flipping the order, so it's more about discovery than delivery, is a key way to figuring out how to design better for reciprocity. So first, understanding the diversity of people, targeting specific segments, creating new practices, and then last, developing the policy that the right conditions exist for the practices to be effective. And if you want to go that route, this means you have to have experimental systems, right? Ones that are open to social R&D, trial and error, to learning. So I guess I brought you back to full circle to culture that supports experimentation. So thanks for the opportunity to share my take on the challenges related to culture and the 3 hows I highlighted: inclusion, bringing people in from the margins, and reciprocity.
Thank you, Susan. I seem to be having, at least from what I can see, problems with my camera. So I will ask the other panel members to just nod if you can hear me. Okay, everyone can hear me. So while my camera goes Twilight Zone, I'll just pretend that I'm hosting this on the radio for now. So thank you, Susan, for that feedback, interesting on the 3 presentations. And I'll ask now Keren Tang to offer her comments.
Well, thank you so much. So my name is Keren Tang, and like Sue, I'm also calling in from Treaty 6 territory in Edmonton, Alberta. In fact, Sue and I used to be co-workers and team members on the Recover initiative that she just mentioned. First, I just want to kind of share a bit of context of what it is that I do. So I currently manage a large-scale social research and development (R&D) initiative called Participatory Canada that is working with a whole host of local partners in 3 Canadian cities and a few more, in fact, and global partners with Participatory City Foundation based in London, UK. And what we're doing is we're testing what we call this practical participatory ecosystem approach with 3 Canadian cities, Kjipuktuk, Halifax, Montreal, and Toronto, based on the learning from the participatory city work in East London. Keeping an eye out for, we're currently in the heat of developing our R&D report that's going to be coming out in June. So I want to break that down a little bit. What does practical participatory ecosystem mean in real life, on the ground, in practice? So it's practical because it's about everyday practical things that people are doing that are useful for them and their family, for their neighbors, for their communities, and for the planet. Ordinary things like cooking that Paul had mentioned in his video, but also making and growing and gardening and whole consortium of things. And participatory in the sense that it is resident-led, that you're cultivating the human agency for people to come together as peer-to-peer, neighbor to neighbor, and rolling up their sleeves and working side by side with each other. And then thirdly is ecosystem, that it's not about things happening in a one-off, in a piecemeal way, as it often happens in community sector, but it is about coordination. It is about things happening in synchrony across a geographic region. In our case, we're looking at neighborhoods, we're looking at boroughs, that you're leveraging all the assets in that zone, and that is how we affect systems change. And so coming back to the 3 videos, certainly we know that social connection is incredibly important and touches on so many outcomes, as Alex mentioned. And in real life, this happens when people are doing things together. They're getting their hands dirty, they're working side by side. And all 3 videos certainly resonate with some aspect of the Participatory Canada work that we're currently involved with. And we call that, we use the language that Sue had touched on called social infrastructure. And, I think that was, resonant with Stefano's presentation around how green physical infrastructure can foster social connections. And in fact, we also see these kinds of social infrastructure as an important mechanism for building community wealth in line with circular and well-being economy frameworks. So I want to touch on 3 things. Number 1 is scale, that I think Paul really talked about in his video. Scale is important. Like he mentioned, we saw you're seeing community cooking activities, not just in one community, but in all the communities where there's a lottery program. But I think to sustain that kind of effort in the long term at that level of scale is hard without the resource and adequate investments to come bring people together, bring people who are unlikely to interact with each other on a day-to-day basis together. And we can't always rely on volunteers and free labor. And from what we have learned this past year with our work in the 3 Canadian cities, even at a much smaller scale, it takes incredible amount of time and labor to develop the relationships and to develop that scale of community programming with things happening in multiple ways, in multiple locations, involving residents who are sharing their skills with one another and developing that human agency. And so this brings me to my second point. If we want investment into programming or into the infrastructure at that level of scale, that needs to be matched with investment, that kind of ambition. And that requires political leadership. In our work, we believe this kind of infrastructure should be a public service, public good, funded, largely in part through the public sector. And currently, social infrastructure is not thought of in the same way as bridges, as roads, as sidewalks, as the commonplaces that you see, typical of physical infrastructure. But we are seeing a shift, I would say, with the recently released federal budget that still has to go through lots of hoops. And we're also seeing lots of interest and demand from the partners and the stakeholders that we work with, not only from the communities, but also from governments of all levels. And I think the challenge is really matching the resources to the ambition and the scale. And lastly, I want to touch on relationships and equity that Sue had talked about quite a bit about in her part. We're seeing increasing divides in our society, in our communities along racial and economic lines, and much of that, have such historical roots that go back generations. And if we know social connections matter and have such major impact on so many aspects of our society, then how do we get people who normally don't interact with each other come together? How do we get them there to that community cooking activity in the first place? And I think we can learn a lot. I certainly learned a lot from working with the Halifax team this past year. Their initiative was called Everyone Every Day Jupuktuk, Halifax, based in the North End, with a much smaller scale prototype that developed a platform for connection centered on Indigenous reconciliation, but inclusive of all. And that takes intention, and that takes thought, and that takes much effort when it comes to building that relationship. And this is manifested by centering cultural knowledge and sharing to this platform, but so is traditional Indigenous teaching that's embedded as working principles in every aspect of the initiative, but also as meaningful connections with elders, as honoring Indigenous knowledge and ways of knowing. So, I guess in a nutshell, so scale, politics, relationships, and equity are the 3 things that I was looking at when I was looking at the videos. Thank you.
Thank you, Keren. That's very interesting comments. I think for now we've decided I'm going to try to leave my camera off because it's probably quite distracting. I'm sorry about that. I'm not sure why that's happening, but we will keep going forward, and I'll ask now Gaynor Watson-Creed to please give us her feedback on the presentation.
Thank you, Val, for that, and to everybody so far for the presentations and also the responses. I'm finding a number of dots connecting for me, which is always really exciting. Just to give you a little bit more of a sense of my background. So I think Val did introduce me as having an assistant dean position in the Faculty of Medicine at Dalhousie University. I'm actually a public health physician by training. And so up until recently was the Deputy Chief Medical Officer of Health for the province of Nova Scotia here in Mi'kma'ki, which is where I'm from. And specifically, I sit in Jupuktuk, so in the Halifax area. And prior to being Deputy Chief Medical Officer for the entire province, I was the Medical Officer of Health for the City of Halifax for 13 years. I am also the chair of the Board of Engage Nova Scotia, as Val mentioned, and we have embarked on a quality of life initiative here that many of you have heard about already during this conference with our CEO, Danny Graham, leading that work. And that work includes the development of a quality of life framework and questionnaire that we delivered to several thousand Nova Scotians, where we were really seeking to understand what truly makes Nova Scotians prosperous and happy. I also, though, happen to sit on the board of Community Food Centres of Canada. And so I'm actually going to start my remarks there. So if you don't know the work of Community Food Centres of Canada, this is a large national not-for-profit organization that is actually designed around creating dignified experiences of food preparation and community engagement for communities across Canada. So I think we currently have 13 community food centers across the country and looking to expand that. And so, Paul, I'm going to start with your presentation first, because it resonated with me on that front. And what I like about the model and what I hear in your framing, and also in the responses from Keren and Sue, is that at the end of the day, what that model provides is that notion of a neutral third space that many of you may be familiar with. So that idea that there is a space where community can come together without obligation and without expectation of what credentials you need to have to come into the door, and experience the same dignity, sort of no matter who you are, no matter where you are in your life, and participate in something, again, without obligation, that is beneficial for you and beneficial for the community at the same time. And so, what I like the idea of the sort of third space activity being food, but I think that activity could be almost anything. And so that brings me, in fact, to Stefano's presentation, which is probably where my heart sort of grew the most, because I think the idea of building these opportunities and these third places into community is actually key. And a lot of my public health work and experience as the medical officer for the City of Halifax was in healthy built environments. And I really see that the opportunity has to be there in the built environment. It has to exist. It has to be inviting. It has to invite welcome in order for it to be successful. So I would worry that any initiatives that aren't designed in that way around creating happiness and intergenerational opportunities and opportunities across income groups, and again, without obligation, so that folks don't feel pressured or put upon to participate in the opportunity, but can also benefit from it passively, are important. And I think the opportunity around being deliberate about how we build our communities is there. And so on that front, Keren, I agree with you 100% that the idea that this infrastructure could be considered social infrastructure that is a sort of a taxpayer funded good and right for citizens is an important one. And I would agree that I'm not sure that we've done that. I also think within that built environment space, there is the opportunity to recognize the importance for happiness around connection with nature. And I think we have examples of that across the world. So I think inviting people to programming is one aspect, but I think simply inviting people easily to be able to access nature is another piece that we would have to add in. And so I think, Stefano, your presentation highlighted that. There's some excellent work by Colin Ellard, who's a psychologist at University of Waterloo, that looks specifically at the psychology of being in well-built environments versus poorly built environments. And I think it has a lot to say about what the qualities of a healthy urban environment need to be for that psychological impact. So I'll comment then lastly on the presentation from Alex. And thank you for the presentation, Alex. And again, social prescribing is, as a physician, something that is not new to me, and it has certainly been experimented with in Ontario with some good results, as you have pointed to in Australia and other parts of the world. Again, I think if social prescribing is going to be effective, then I think some of what we need to look at is what are the ways in which those prescriptions include nature, include intergenerational opportunities, include potentially opportunities without obligation again. So I worry a little bit in that model that the expectation of being a joiner for the 30% of us who are introverts and only need a few really meaningful connections with people in the world in order to thrive could be overlooked. And I think that's an important one, but also the intergenerational and more spontaneous and therefore more authentic opportunities that come from a well-built city, I think would have to be part of that. I also think that central to all of this, and this will be my last comment, is that there is a notion around how you build a city that is in fact welcoming to all of its citizens. We have been in and out of a conversation about welcome in Nova Scotia for several years now. And what's interesting about that is that we're recognizing that the elements of welcome are not necessarily easily designed, if I can put it that way. So there is something inherent about a welcome. It requires the person that you are approaching to be welcoming towards you, which means that you yourself don't necessarily have control over the type of welcome that you experience. And so I think as we look at any of these interventions, we have to keep in mind that the quality of the welcome and how you design in however you can, the elements of that would be important. And I think I'll leave my comments at that.
Thank you very much, Gaynor, and thank you to the three respondents for those insights and interesting comments and ways of both drawing the three presentations together and also pulling on threads that resonate with the work that you all are involved in. What we'll do now is give an opportunity for the researchers who presented their videos at the very beginning to comment on what our three respondents have said. I will point out, though, that Alex Haslam is not with us live. It's the middle of the night in Australia, so I suppose that's one very important reason why he's not here. But so please, if you have, if there are specific comments after or questions for Alex, please keep in mind that he's not with us. But I will ask Stefano and Paul if they would like to say a few words in response to Keren, Gaynor, and Sue's comments. Stefano, go ahead.
Yeah. How to include people, how to create participation, how to make people meet, how to bring them together. Well, the basis is the urban infrastructure. Third place is a very good word for that. So we must have spaces in which people can meet, but they must be walking or biking, because the key to create relationships is the frequency of positive interactions. Even just saying hello to a neighbor or create trust basis for creating a social fabric with it. So from this point of view, the urban infrastructure is key. There must be pedestrian areas, there must be green and all the bases that people need to meet. But beyond that, on this we can build a lot, and the idea of cooking together is a very good idea. One of the many things that we can do for that. Another widely held, applied kind of innovation is urban gardens. Urban gardens work a lot to create community, sense of community, a sense of belonging. They stick people to the places and to people. And well, let me mention a very interesting experiment that has been run in Philadelphia in the US. The group of researchers identified hundreds of vacant urban lots. They were abandoned, full of garbage or with plants growing savage. And they cleaned and greened, in the sense that they planted plants there, in a half of the sample of vacant lots. And in the other half, they did not do anything. That was the control group. And before greening and cleaning the vacant lots, they interviewed the neighboring people living nearby, hundreds of them, asking them about their conditions, their mental health conditions, especially on depression. And then they greened and cleaned half of the vacant lot. After that, 1 year and a half after that, they came back to interview people living nearby. And what they found is, let me see the exact number, minus 41% of the depressive feelings, and minus 52% of feeling of worthlessness. And this effect was much stronger in the area, in the poor neighborhoods of the city, where people is not used to have something which is really cured, something on which people take care. So even very simple and low-cost interventions, improving the environment, giving people access, some access, even just viewing the green, have an important impact on happiness. My particular concern on participation and inclusion is mostly about two population groups, the youngsters and the elderly, who are the groups at higher risk of social isolation. And from this point of view, the availability of social fabric at walking distance is fundamental for them. And we have to create spaces in which relationships and the social fabric can take place. That's very important, especially for them. Let me mention the way in which in Japan they deal with the loneliness of the elderly. They are perfectly aware that this is a big problem for healthcare, and loneliness is a killer for old people. So what they do is what they have is a national strategy for building communities for the elderly. This strategy is national from the point of view of guidelines. The government just gives guidelines, but then it's the local administrations that build these communities. They do many things. One very important thing is to build, they call it community salon, in which the elderly meet frequently, and they do all kinds of mental and physical exercise, gym, or they have lectures, conferences. They discuss topics that they suggested by the people, by the elderly. So in this way, they create a community between them, and the results from the point of view of health are really impressive. Those who participate to this community saloon see an enormous drop in the most typical diseases affecting the old age, such as the Alzheimer's disease or dementia, and it's a very big effect. I mean that in this kind of intervention are very effective from the point of view of the cost comparison of cost and benefits, because they are low cost and they save a lot of money in healthcare. Japan has the highest longevity in the world, and above all, the average condition of the elderly there is much better than in the West. If you walk a Japanese city, you would be struck by the enormous amount of people which are 90 years old or even more, who are autonomous, independent, they go shopping, they walk very slowly, but they need no help. They are autonomous. And so I think this is, in a big part, the result of this kind of strategy. It's a national strategy starting from the awareness that loneliness is an enormous problem from the point of view of well-being, and then from health. Yeah. I'm not sure I answered all of your questions, so if I forgot something, please remind it to me and I'll go on.
Thank you, Stefano. Interesting additions indeed. Paul, would you like to reply to some of the comments made by our responders? I think you're muted, Paul.
I said, definitely, I would like to say something. Yes, and thank you very much for the opportunity to speak on this. And thank you very much, Susan, Keren, and Gaynor, for your kind comments. My comments are going to be a little bit boring because I think we all agree in this session. So we should have had a disruptor here who disagreed with us, but we don't. so, you know, like everybody else, I think social connections is the key thing. And like everybody else, I sort of think culture matters a lot, and that central government can do a lot if it were so willing. So yes, third space is a nice way to think about it. Yes, politics is important. So the way I wanted to say that is first, as it were, give a little bit of good news perspective. You know, I'm so happy that we can have these kind of chats. When I started out with this more than 25 years ago, if you said you were working on well-being, people sort of made signs as if you were a vampire and they didn't want to know you at conferences, and they presumed that you were sort of batshit crazy. And now we are at the policy table, and there are these conferences every week in lots of countries. So in a way, it is nice to see that we're arriving, right? It's a great, great thing. And I'm sure Stefano and many of the others will have had the same experience over time, going from outsiders to insiders. So it's hope. But part of that hope has been that we've gone from very much the outside with well-being to the inside, and that the well-being revolution has been led up from the bottom. So from my perspective, central governments are the last to become serious about well-being, the very last. They are the holdouts, the ones least interested, most critical, most under other pressures, right? In effect, they're the last bastion of anti-well-being, if you like, right? And I don't think that's well understood that they are the last. I think at the individual level, the positive psychology revolution has really worked, and that lots of people have themselves taken up the notion that they should care about their own happiness, that of their family and loved ones, and that of their local community. So in a large extent, most of the policy advice comes to the conclusion that you should just let communities do their things and they will sort of work it out, and they have worked it out. So the hope thing, right? The second point I wanted to say was to sort of echo what all three commenters said, which is that what works is often very culturally specific. It depends very much on place, what is found to be important, what is found to be useful. And that means that you sort of want things to be led often by community groups, volunteer groups, larger groups that represent either a province or basically have something, and also let them experiment things. And I think that hence, in that sense, top-down policy doesn't work for a lot of things, particularly not for community formation. I think for community formation, just let communities do that. They do that very well. And if you look at the grand sort of arc of where life satisfaction has gone, then it's been great the last 20 years. I mean, up until the Corona crisis, we've seen huge increases throughout Europe. And the cities in Northern Europe are absolutely fantastic. You know, they're safe, clean, low crime. They all do different stuff, but they're essentially fantastic living spaces that are working out how to do it. But I'm not sure that the model of, as it were, you know, what works in Northern Europe would work so well everywhere else, right? So when Stefano says that we should effectively kill the car because that works in Copenhagen, I wonder how that goes in communities which are very spaced far apart, where people need their car to visit their family, which is often very far away, not close by as in Denmark, where also politically that is difficult, or where politically property developers run the roost and they just care about high housing prices, and they wouldn't want, as it were, cities to be made less lucrative for high-rise finance places, which make them a lot of money. So I would be careful by saying, oh, Copenhagen has got the recipe for cities around the world. I think that essentially cities have to work this out themselves a little bit, but that the principle that it's about community formation should work in other places. And then the third thing about how to tackle central government, I think that is a tough thing. I've definitely worked at this myself for the last couple of years here in the UK. But governments are under all kinds of other pressures, right? It's the other pressures that make life difficult for them, right? So, you know, they worry about legal liability if they let too much community blow out, right? That's sort of, people can then get in fights, or They can get in conflict with each other, and that can get managers fired. So maybe they don't want much community life, either on their own workforce or in the companies that they spawn. There's also, of course, political fights about cars, gated communities. Lots of people want less inequality, but of course, the people who have most want more inequality. So there is a larger fight. And I think that in that sense, we're then onto many other topics where we might not agree so much, but we're also, we don't have so much agency. So there's also a question of what the well-being community, as it were, should aim for. And I think the low-hanging fruit is a good thing to aim for in the short to medium run.
Thank you, Paul. Again, interesting comments, and there's so much there to dig into. I will see if I can ask a leading question or two in a second, but I will just remind the audience that you are free to ask questions en anglais comme en français, in writing, par écrit, in the question and answer boxes at the bottom of your screen. And Jennifer is kindly curating these, so we'll send them along to make sure that I get them and that we can get to audience questions for the participants. So please feel free to do that, and we will save some time towards the end for questions from participants. I just maybe ask for one more go around. There are so many central themes, and as Paul has pointed out, probably if we dug down into the details of everyone's perspective, we would find more differences than there appear to be on the surface. But one of the things that keeps coming up for me, besides these sort of dual themes of built environment and social connections, and the links that are to be made, that are made, and what are sort of the difficulties of making those connections between what are a lot of times separate policy domains, separate domains of intervention, but there are certainly connections. So is it a case of, if we build it, they will come? But what is the sort of ways that you see, or what are some of the ways that you see of reaching out to populations that are perhaps less involved, perhaps actively marginalized within urban spaces, to get involved in spaces that are created by built environment policies? That might be a little opaque as a question. I hope that you see what I'm getting at, but I'll start with the respondents this time. If you don't have anything that you'd like to add to that, feel free not to, but I'll ask Keren, Gaynor, and Sue if you would just hold up your hands if you might have something you would like to say about those connections between the built environment, social connections, and how to sort of create the fit between the two with policy. Sue, please go ahead.
I didn't mention, but I'm an urban planner by background, and also part of on the board of of an advocacy group called Pass for People, which is all about active transportation. So anyways, Stefano, your presentation deeply resonated with me. But there are challenges for sure. For example, the idea of the gardens or taking vacant lots. There's huge bureaucratic challenges for having anything like that happen or trying anything different. There's permitting and building code, or I don't know, just so many things. There's lots of red tape. I've been involved in doing some kind of interventions like that locally, and I'm in the city bureaucracy. I know it's a lot of ins and outs, and it's still really hard. That's a challenge. It's a challenge as well, to change our development regulations. We're in the process right now of overhauling our zoning bylaw and getting rid of parking minimums. There are no parking minimums in Edmonton anymore, which is amazing. That's one of the things that supports what Stefano's talking about, higher density, mixed use. But there's lots of things that need to change in our regulations, in all the levels of plans that we have in place. And another challenge is changes to urban form take time. you know, what Paul said in terms of, you know, car-oriented places that are developed, they're not going to change overnight to become more similar to Copenhagen. It's going to take decades. And that's a big challenge, you know, so yeah, these are challenges. And then in terms of like including, you know, perspectives of people from the margins in the design or development of these things, this is another challenge because like right now, I don't know about you, but you probably have some elements of defensive architecture, for example, in your cities. You know, we have to let go of putting spikes on things or making benches, you know, uncomfortable so you can't lie on them and stuff like that. Like there's a lot of practices right now that we have to let go of.
Thank you, Sue. Gaynor, you would like to add something, please?
Yeah, thanks, Val, and thanks for that, Sue. So I can see why we all gravitated towards this panel, perhaps, because I think I explained that in my public health career, I've certainly done a lot of work on healthy built environments. And in fact, I continue to be the vice chair of Halifax's Community Design Advisory Committee, which is currently writing the development plan for the urban core in the city of Halifax. I guess, you know, some of what I don't know what the answer is in terms of how we, you know, sort of get to those bigger opportunities. And I completely hear you, Paul, on who the laggards are in the conversation. And I think it is those big central governments. I also think, though, to Stefano's point, there's in some ways a point at which they become not irrelevant to the conversation because for funding and legislative development and all kinds of reasons, they of course remain relevant. But there's a way in which communities do have some agency over this, and I think you mentioned this as well, Paul, that makes the role of those larger central governments a little bit irrelevant. And so I think what we often, at the central government level, overlook is that these conversations are very local in their orientation. If they're going to work, they need to be. That puts the agency in the hands of municipal governments, but also of local community groups. And there's policy windows that open there all the time that if you can take advantage of them even once or twice with a demonstration project, I think it's really difficult to ignore the value of that project once it's embedded in the community. And so when I think of a few examples in Halifax, one that I was intimately involved with and one that I was peripherally involved with, you know, the Central Library in the city of Halifax, for those of you who know the story of the Central Library, is a beautiful example of where a policy window opened with a municipal government that was willing to do some experimentation, a consultation process that really brought in the voice of community, and a result that nobody can ignore, that everybody loves, and it makes it really difficult for the next major third place development, to do anything differently, right? Everybody wants to see us replicate that, the beauty that was the Central Library. And so even having that one success, I think, provides a policy platform for others. The other example is an example we had a few years ago around some food security pilot we did with the city of Halifax that resulted in our mobile market, which, you know, had the city sort of say, okay, so if we sort of put the rules aside for a second, and we agree that we want this to be safe, but we also want it to be productive, what would be wrong with putting healthy food on a city bus and taking it to communities that need it with some fanfare? And could it be just that simple? And so I feel like the more we can support communities to take advantage of those open policy opportunities where you have the right-minded people in maybe a tiny bit of space for a short window of time to do something that's impactful, those demonstrations actually carry the day for much longer than we would think.
Thank you, Gaynor. Interesting comments. Keren, would you add a few, please?
Sure, yeah. I actually can't remember what the original question was, but I think I'll just build off of the conversation right now. So first, I just want to touch on some of the discussion around car culture and, you know, accessibility of, say, hubs by walking and biking. Some of the things that we've learned in the past year around these demonstration projects, in fact, they were guided by a set of inclusive design principles. And the word design came up quite a bit, I think, in Sue and Gaynor's presentation, and that is important. How do you design for inclusion? How do you design for that welcoming, that organic, that spontaneous? That is possible. But one of the things is that if you want people to get involved in their community, they have to kind of be able to walk there. They have to bike there, and so we are not at the scale of the participatory city platform in East London. That is, a borough of 200,000 people in Barking and Dagenham. And it's manifested as a set of community storefronts, resident makerspace. There's vacant lots, street corner orchards, many different pieces of assets. So that creates this interconnected ecosystem across this borough. Because if people are not going to take a bus, across town to go and participate in some kind of workshop or whatever, they're going to want to walk. And as they're walking there, they might pass by the community garden, or they might pass by, something happening, and then have those moments of spontaneous interactions. And one of the questions that we had considered this past year, if you look at the 3 cities we worked with, Montreal, Toronto are very high density cities. In fact, in both places, some of these prototyping and demonstration projects were happening with tenants in apartment buildings. And, if you want to talk about urban form, it's not just cars, but lots of these types of, vertical structures can also be barriers. We've learned that residents who live 1 floor apart, in Toronto, the demonstration project was in Regent Park, which is one of the largest, has a history of largest social housing in the country. And right now, it's seeing lots of mixing of tenants from market renters and from the social housing, but people who live 1 floor apart have never crossed paths with each other in the 3 years that they've lived. And it is when coming out together over some of these mutual activities. And I agree with you, Gaynor. It almost doesn't matter what it is that they're doing, but it's about creating that platform. It could be cooking. It could be, in this case, it was actually growing indigenous trees in that local community. But you're creating these connections more. So that's a very high density example, whereas I think in Halifax, it's quite different. And now we have conversations with some of the suburban communities in Laval and Edmonton, where I am, it's a very sprawling city. So how might that kind of accessibility, how might that kind of urban infrastructure be designed so that it still facilitates people walking to those locations? And I guess on the second piece, and I think this kind of touches a little bit on the role of the government and which level, to your point, Val, you said, is it a case of build it and they will come? And I actually think it's build it together and people might stay. I think when it comes to funding for these kinds of stuff, I think central government plays a huge role, but at the end of the day, it is the municipalities, the city governments that are really the implementers. And we're seeing that in all 3 cities, the people who are really active from within the city, who are kind of there, alongside folks from the community are the municipalities. But we're in a very, very challenging times right now. However, I think looking ahead, there's lots of opportunities for COVID recovery. For example, how do we strengthen these networks, these infrastructures, so that the next wave of shock, whatever that might be, we're better prepared. And I think that is a policy window that is on the table right now. And finally, I guess just to touch on this point about municipal government, when I first worked at the city of Edmonton with Sue, it was around social innovation. And I think there's a greater appetite now for experimentation, for research and development, for demonstration. And again, it is that level of government that is most open to that. So anyways, that's my 3 cents.
Thank you, Keren. There's certainly a lot to be said that's probably beyond the time and scope we have here, but a lot for us to think about. I'll just give Paul and Stefano an opportunity if they wanted to chime in on any of what's been said. All three of you contributed more than I asked for, so thank you for that. And Paul and Stefano, if you'd like to add something. Paul, you go ahead. You're muted. Paul, just unmute your microphone, please.
Unmute. Yes, I was excusing myself because, again, very boring. I agree basically with what has been said. Let me just add two things. One is, because Alex isn't here and I like his work, I want to say that part of his perspective is that there are such things as very long-run investments, things that pay off in 30, 40 years' time still. And that, of course, has to do with how we educate children to be good in terms of their emotional skills and their bonding skills, if you like, so their emotional, psychological intelligence. And he elevates that, of course, then also to adults via the programs that he champions, of which there are others around. And those things can indeed sort of be put on steroids by government, but can also be implemented by communities. So the kind of thing he was talking about is something that can be basically implemented, slightly adjusted in all outskirts of particularly the Anglo-Saxon world, because most of these things sort of exist in English, and so nobody has to translate it. And so his kind of point is, very much in the mix as well, and where governments can make a much bigger difference. I will say that I think places like Copenhagen, who are sort of, champions of hygge, of their word for happiness, form great examples for others to follow. But I think in the context of North America, less so Canada than the US, where there's this huge inequality, I think those examples will be followed by sort of, rich, well-organized places, gated communities, gated cities. But I'm not sure that they will easily be taken up in more slum areas where there's huge amount of crime, where a lot of public things would quickly get vandalized, or where there are just strong political interests to keep the place as dismal as possible. And there, I think one is in a much tougher, longer run political space, whereby they become the last places that are almost allowed to become happy, if you like, right? And where my honest advice would be to them to look after themselves as much as possible until the rest allows them.
Thank you, Paul. And Stefano, would you add something?
Yeah, well, let me clarify something. First of all, I'm not proposing to kill cars. I'm proposing to kill urban cars. And it is not always possible. I mean, when a city is built for cars, as are typical American suburbs, you cannot kill cars there. It's impossible. And it's also impossible to organize an efficient public transportation because distances are too long, the density of the population is very low, so buses would travel almost half empty, almost empty. So we must be very careful in the way we build the new neighborhoods, because their heritage will last centuries. So if we build a neighborhood where which is car dependent, it's impossible to reverse this in practice. So basically what I'm proposing is good for, is feasible for cities with a reasonable high density. Otherwise, it is impossible. But however, this kind of interventions has been done in cities which are very different from Copenhagen, even on a much bigger scale. In, well, Paris, for instance, is going the same path. They declared a war to cars. And it's a much bigger scale. But there are examples, even in poor countries, of this kind of urban organization. The mayor of Bogota, Enrique Peñalosa, made a revolution in that city. That was a city which was strangled by cars. And he strongly limited private cars. He built a very efficient public transportation by bus, and he began to close parts of the city to cars, especially on Sundays. When entire neighborhoods were closed to cars on Sundays, and they made parties in there by artificially creating pedestrian areas. And when this major lost the elections, and a new major came after him with different policies, people began to close the neighborhoods on Sunday. They did that by themselves. It was a grassroots movement, perpetuating the policy of Enrique Peñalosa. So there are many versions of this idea that cars should be limited, car dependence should be fighted, and they can be applied to very different cities and very different scales of operation. And another very important thing, it is true, Paul, that top-down policies do not work to build communities. But it is also true that the policies build cities, and if you build a city in such a way that to build a social fabric is impossible, that's a condition that remains for centuries. So the basis of the urban infrastructure allow or cannot allow the conditions to build a social fabric. And that's very important. Then I agree with you that top-down policies do not work to build communities. In fact, my example of Japan is an example in which the role of the central government is just to give guidelines to local administrations, and local administrations in practice just provide the space, the room, the halls for these communities alone. But then they are organized by ONGs, voluntary association. It's all voluntary work made by local people. So it's the bottom-up mechanism is embedded in the Japanese policy. And another observation, you were talking about the social skill of young people, especially with reference to schooling, but the biggest school of social skill has been the road, the street for centuries, because kids were playing grouped in the streets outside, and they have always grown up like this. This kind of profile of child life that we build, it's an entirely new experiment. Kids are alone now. They grow up in front of screens, and they never, most of them, they never experience group life. And that used to be a very important source of the development of social skills. So if we want more emotionally intelligent kids, the first thing to do is to bring them back to the streets, to play together in groups, because group dynamics used to teach them all the social skills that would accompany them for along all their life. And finally, I would say that this kind of city I'm proposing would work much better than current cities in emergencies like the COVID-19 pandemic, because, meeting outdoor is the only way not to reduce the risk of infections. So this kind of city would work very much. The data from Sweden, where a lockdown has never been applied, show that the mobility after the pandemic breakout dramatically fold, but the mobility to parks increased because they are the perfect context in which relationships can continue to take place even in a situation of pandemic. I finished.
Thank you. Again, there's a lot to think about there. And I think we'll come back around maybe because we do have a few questions that are coming in from the audience, and also bringing up the topic of youth and the ability, incentive to socialize in public spaces. There are a lot of even policies over the last 20 years or so that have actively discouraged youth from congregating in public spaces. So I'm kind of wondering how that fits in. But Gaynor has indicated that she has a question she would like to ask of the other panel members. So Gaynor, go ahead.
I think your question is probably more interesting, Val. So I just maybe one quick point before we go there, because I'm thinking about this conversation now is largely centering, I think, on sort of questions about the built environment and how do you physically structure happiness and opportunities for happiness into a city. And I feel like I've had two experiences of that, and I'd really like to hear from my fellow panelists if they have any anecdotes to, in particular, the negative experience. So I mentioned the mobile market, which was a food security project that we ran in the city of Halifax around getting healthy food to some fruits and vegetables to underserved neighborhoods. And one of the models that we looked at when we were developing that was the city of Ottawa. And Ottawa Public Health had developed this beautiful model with a very local neighborhood that was food insecure to bring this healthy fruits and vegetables. And what emerged was this pop-up market on the weekend for fruits and vegetables becoming so successful that in this impoverished part of Ottawa, you had people in BMWs and Lexuses and Mercedes-Benzes driving to this market to do vegetable shopping. And the response from the residents, and I did interview the resident who was leading the project, was that this project brings us dignity. We get to host every weekend the coolest vegetable market in the city of Ottawa. And people in their Mercedes-Benzes are not afraid to come to our neighborhood to buy their fruits and vegetables the way they might have been afraid before we had this market. Now people know us and we're not scary anymore. And her story of the dignity that the model brought was just so inspiring that I actually asked her to repeat it, and could I record it because I wanted to keep it for forever, and then I lost the recording. But I'll never forget the conversation because it was beautiful. On the flip side, though, I feel like what you described, Paul, in terms of the difficulty around low-income neighborhoods and the opportunities that may be less frequent there is a real one. And so the question I keep asking the urban planners in my environment, and I still find myself in conversation with urban planners on a fairly regular basis, is this question of how do you create those opportunities and not at the same time create gentrification? And most of the time when I ask the question, I get something like, gosh, I wish you hadn't asked the question. So I'm asking it here to you and to anybody else in the audience who might have answers. I'm just curious if there is actually an antidote to that.
Go ahead, Stefano.
Yeah. You touched the crucial point, because all the kind of interventions that I'm proposing tend to create gentrification, which is a source, which is the most terrible source of the destruction of social fabric in the cities. I've been reflecting for years on this kind of contradiction. And my solution, the only answer is, I finally got convinced that the only instrument we have against gentrification is a rent cap. There's no other way. So all these interventions I'm proposing should be combined with rent cap. It should be it should follow from the principle that houses are not up for speculation.
Wow. Thank you. That's an interesting and could take us in another fascinating and important dimension. But I think, Sue, you wanted to add something?
Oh, there. Oh, there, I'm unmuted. Yeah, I was just thinking about a prototype that I was involved with, and also thinking back to a conference that Keren and I both happened to go to a couple of years ago in Detroit by the Gale Institute, where the issue of gentrification came up. And there were presentations by people in neighborhoods that were, you know, from external kind of perspective, gentrified, but it was done by the people in community, by themselves, in a way that made sense to them. I mean, they weren't intentionally gentrifying. They were making improvements. They were making projects, co-creating, co-designing, very, very like hyper locally. And from an outsider, you might think it's gentrification, but it was people doing it for themselves. So, but with my example, with the prototype I was involved with, it was called Project Welcome Mat, and it was a project on the sidewalk space in front of one of our social service providers that borders on downtown. Really intimidating space. People there all the time. A lot of behaviors that are problematic. Lots of police having to come by, and people in the office towers that are like less than a block away avoid this space. Anyways, we looked at how to change that space. Would it change relationships, both within that social service provider's, kind of sphere and beyond with the community? And we co-designed it with the community. We started by asking the people who use that space how they use it, what they'd like to see there. And then we brought the things they asked for and let them figure out how to arrange them, how to do it. And it completely transformed. And maybe that looks a bit like, very small scale gentrification, but people were super pumped. It wasn't about so much the change in the space as the provision of dignity, sense of pride, the kind of connections that were able to form in that space. And the ownership they felt over those changes themselves. They were so proud they did that. So I think there's something in there that helps you address this concern of gentrification.
Thank you. I think I'll restate, because we have a question from the participants that is along the lines of what we were just discussing about youth and the role of youth and the role in these policies in affecting the ability of youth to socialize and use public spaces. So the person who's asked this question has specifically directed it at Stefano, and also I think though asked for Gaynor's perspective, but everyone's is welcome. And I will restate what I said earlier, is that keeping in mind, I think we saw this particularly throughout the late 1990s and the early 2000s, but a whole host of cities really all over the developed world began adopting policies that actively limited the access, not necessarily the access, but the ability of youth to congregate in public spaces, including things like, playing music that would be annoying or was thought to be annoying to youth, or using high-pitched sounds that was more likely to irritate youth, and policies on incivilities. And I know many major cities, including Montreal in Canada, passed these anti-incivilities policies, and an incivility were things like hanging out in the park and spitting on the ground, or making too much noise, etc. So in light of that, and then the participant asks everyone again, but I'll direct it first to Stefano, is do you think having more accessible and better quality third places translates to adolescents socializing more in person in today's age of online social networking, given that this group has generally limited agency and mobility to use these public spaces. So I'll ask first, Stefano, if maybe you can comment on that first.
Se gli adolescenti lo fanno.
Well, basically, the problem of many people think that teenagers are uninterested in social life because basically they're always on their screens. But their social isolation of the youth came before the advent of social networks or the internet. I mean, in a single generation since the 70s, the radius of activity of children diminished by 90%. The radius of activity is the area around home where children are allowed to roam unsupervised. In practice, their free space remained only their home. And that began much before the advent of the social networks. So my impression is that they stick so much to social networks and screen because they are substitutes for the social relationships and the groups they never had in their life. They never met life group. So I'm sure that if other relational opportunities were created for young people, they would exploit that, because this situation that has created with social networks and the internet a lot of addiction by young people is a reaction to relational deprivation, which is basically built by the form of our cities, of the built environment. So I think there's a big demand for that. But of course, we also need a cultural change, because from these generations, which are trained and grown up in a situation of dependence on screen, we cannot expect from them such a great enthusiasm for living together with other people. But we may grow up different people if we change the urban shape.
Thanks, Stefano. Is there anyone else who would like to add on that before we take another? Yes, Paul, please.
Yes, to sort of go back to that point and the previous one, this is partially what I meant earlier with, as it were, cultural specific, right? So Stefano likes to see the return of street life, which I remember as well from my youth, although there was a lot of bullying on that street, which was also rife in Italy and was a good thing. But I think one of the major reasons why in Anglo-Saxon countries doesn't happen is not that there's no space, that there's no street, but parents don't want it. Parents don't want their kids unsupervised outside until they're about, 32. So I think that there's a culture there which has to do with lots of other developments which are not easily reversed. I don't think you will find the middle class Anglo-Saxon parent wanting to sort of be told that they're untrusting of their child and should let them play outside and run the risks and benefits of being outside. They're just not going to accept that. They're going to want some kind of supervised play, which means a different kind of thing than an open street. It's more a gated park, if you like. And I think policy has to take account of that, whether I want the culture to change to what Stefano likes, which I agree with, or not. It's just not the reality. On the gentrification, I wanted to add that in a way, gentrification has all kinds of benefits. It does mean that people who lived there originally are pushed out, but often if they owned a house, they're given a big wealth transfer because they're sort of bought out. But you can do the same thing elsewhere, wherever those people go in principle. So we've seen this in the Netherlands with social housing, which had this kind of rent cap that Stefano said, but that just means that they secretly rented it out to somebody who was richer in order to get the wealth transfer. And they themselves moved out. So I don't think rent caps solve anything at all. But what then happened in the Netherlands is via town planning, lots of the other cities they went to were sort of planned to be very nice places and to have lots of these meeting spaces. So I agree that particularly urban planning, which is not so much central government, but local government, has a huge role to play. And in that sense, again, I'm very hopeful about the things that have been going on and are still possible.
Thanks. Keren, you wanted to add something? And then I think what I'll do is ask one final question, and I'll ask each of you to give a 1.5 minute reply. But Keren, you first.
Oh, I just saw Gaynor raise her hand too.
Uh-oh.
Maybe I'll just kind of touch on the 2 points that Paul had brought up. So I used to be a coordinator for an intertribal youth center with the Montreal Native Friendship Center. And part of that was around creating spaces, intentional spaces where youth can see themselves, represented in that space, in their cultural identity to come together. Right now in Edmonton, I'm involved. I have been involved in a number of conversations around youth, and in this case, we are talking about teenagers and young adults, where there is part of the problem, or they're seen as nuisance, and they're hanging out in all these places because there's actually no space for them to go. In some parts of the city, there's very limited space that is welcoming, and I think we come back to this issue of inclusion. How do you intentionally design for that? And I want to just touch on some of those design principles that we had talked about. One of which is welcoming children is an indicator. I know children, as young as toddlers, 4 years old, it's not quite the same thing as teenagers. But the point is, young children are not just they're not just there to be babysat so that the parents can participate. Teenagers are not nuisances to be controlled so that, the rest of the community can feel safe. I think that it's the recognition that they all have something to offer. And, from what we have seen, in some of these cities, kids as young as 4 years old can work with other 4-year-olds and teach them things as well. And they can learn from each other. And that's a really important indicator of inclusion. And so I feel like part of it is that changing that frame, that narrative that Sue had mentioned at the top of the hour, around, gifts and, strength-based versus deficit. And I think we've always seen youth in that light. And if we change that narrative, I think that opens up a lot of opportunities. But also, this piece that Gaynor had talked about in terms of intergenerational, we know that when we have elders in the classrooms, for example, it actually contributes positively to, academic achievements. For the students. So when we have more spaces that different kinds of people can come together, whether it's intergenerational or intercultural, it has, massive benefits for everyone. And I think right now, the way maybe it's, funding, how those programs are designed, it's very targeted. It's either youth program or senior program, or, but I think we need more opportunities for something that is much more open. Just very quickly on the point of gentrification, this past year, and working under COVID conditions on initiatives that's about participation and bringing people together is incredibly difficult. And somehow we manage it. Lots of virtual activities. And of course, COVID restrictions is very different in Toronto, Montreal, and Halifax. But in Toronto, like I mentioned, it is in Regent Park, which is actually a fastly gentrifying community, that you see lots of high rises where people have become increasingly disconnected from each other, particularly that separation between socioeconomic class. And in Montreal, it's in a part of the neighborhood where you have a very established older Francophone Quebecois population that has seen a significant incoming of newcomers and allophones who speak neither French nor English as their first language. And then in Halifax, it's quite interesting because it's a lot of the activities are, and I'm sure, Gaynor, you're much more familiar with the context there. A lot of the programming and the activities are in the Friendship Center, the Mi'kmaq Native Friendship Center. And it's about creating connections with the people who come to the programming and the services at the center who don't necessarily live there, and creating those connections with people who actually do live in the neighborhoods. And lots of the comments from the residents are, it's been too long. We've been living in parallel with each other. It's about time that we came together. People who have lived there for, decades, for the first time, they're actually going inside. And that didn't just come about, randomly. That came about by design. That came about by a lot of intention. And I think there's an appetite. We're all kind of in our own homes now, doing all these kinds of virtual, and people have this thirst of like meeting people who are not like themselves, who are, crossing. And just one last story to kind of maybe leave you with. So in Toronto, there is a senior housing in Regent Park that has gotten very involved with some of the activities. Back in the fall, they started with hydroponic projects that was meant to seed, plants kind of in their own units, because they weren't allowed to even get out of their room and interact with other seniors in that building. But the idea was that, maybe when things get better, we can kind of come together and figure out how to kind of grow hydroponically for the whole building. But anyways, that didn't happen. And when kind of phase 2 programming rolled out a few months later, that group of seniors, lots of comments and feedback coming in just to be like, how do we connect more with people, not just in our building, but outside, because we want to meet people. So I guess just some anecdotes to share around, I think design has is quite important for both of these aspects.
I'll just weigh in very quickly on the youth question, because I think it's an important one, and it brings me back to something I had mentioned earlier around welcome. So 2 things. One is, I think in the question of how do we make our environments more inclusive of youth, and what does their presence contribute to our overall sense of happiness in the community? I think there's a lot that we can learn probably from our Indigenous communities on that front. I think they do a much better job of being inclusive of all ages and abilities than non-Indigenous communities do, at least in Canada. I don't know what the worldwide experience is with that. So I would put that out there. I think, though, there is a research question to be asked around what is the relationship between welcome, welcomeness, welcomeability, I've seen it referred to in the literature, and happiness and community. There is not a lot of literature, as far as I know, that looks specifically at what the qualities of an appropriate and sort of impactful welcome are. But I think they're related to this conversation. And so I would just point that out as a research question that I think is begging to be asked.
So I think we only have a minute or so. But I did want to bring up a question that's come up for a few people, a few of the participants. Are this link that, Stefano, you made it early and explicitly in your presentation. It's been implicit, but also come out a few times. And that is the link between happiness and sustainability, is how Stefano put it in his presentation. But then there's also the question of health. And so one of the conference attendees points out that in the most recent World Happiness Report, the Standard Development Goals 12 and 13, so those that are about responsible production and consumption and climate change, were found to be negatively correlated with well-being. So what do you see? And I'll ask you, I'm really going to ask for just a short soundbite from each of you, but what do you see as the implication for this on well-being, and on sustainability? And then the related question from our participants is that it seems that the density that we need to promote in order to protect the environment is in conflict with human health. So I'm assuming around things like, a whole host of things, but just in terms of density, pollution, noise pollution, etc. So how do we find that balance? And then for each of you, what is the quick connection? Is it possible to work to improve health, happiness, and sustainability, all in the policies that have been proposed here today? We'll start this time with Sue, if you would.
Yeah, Val, but I had a connection problem, so I lost some of the key words you were saying. What is in? I missed what were you saying about the conflict with sustainability. Well, I'll answer to what I understood. Density is in conflict with health. I'm not sure about that. And I'm not sure that more density means more pollution, especially if we kill cars from densely lived areas. As a matter of fact, if we reduce car dependence, we pollute less, we consume less energy. If we walk more, go more by bike, but that's the basis of the strategy of carbon emission reductions in Copenhagen and in many other cities. Changing mobility. There's nothing more polluting than private transportation. And I'm sorry, I know that this was the second question you were asking, but I missed the first for a connection problem.
The first was related to the most recent World Happiness Report that suggests that the standard development goals around consumption and production and climate change were found to be negatively correlated with well-being. What is the implication of this?
Yeah, you mean more consumption, more growth, less well-being. That's what you mean.
This is a question from a member of the audience, so I would assume yes, but I can't say that for sure. I would assume that the need for yeah, go ahead.
Well, I'm not surprised by this negative correlation between consumption and well-being. Basically, if I have to summarize the findings from happiness studies, I would say that it is much more important what we share than what we own. That's the basic result of happiness studies. Sharing is key. Sharing good places, nice spaces, even the aesthetics of spaces plays a positive role in building happiness. But these are all shared things. And especially the most important thing that we share are our relationships. And that's the most important thing for happiness. Happiness is basically depending on the quality and also the quantity of our relationships, meaning that loneliness, the poverty of relationships, loneliness is the worst form of poverty, even worse. It has an even worse impact on happiness than economic poverty. So I'm not surprised by that.
Okay, thanks. And we'll go to Keren next. And so I'll restate my sort of really narrowing down of the question, because now we are down to about a minute and a half each. But if you would just answer the kind of provocative question, is it possible to reconcile health, happiness, and sustainability in the policies that have been proposed here today?
I mean, in short, yes. I mean, I think that is very fundamental to the initiative that we're working on, Participatory Canada, learning lots from what we have seen in East London, UK. And one thing I will just say is that, you know, when we talk about social infrastructure, yes, it's about social connection, but what we have learned from many of these jurisdictions, the thing that you get people to do together also matter. And I would say circular economy, you know, sharing economy, you know, I've mentioned hydroponics, but there's also lots around local, you know, bike repairing kind of on the block, the things like, you know, not just recycling, but repurposing textile, repurposing like recycled goods, but, you know, enabling people to kind of learn those skills to do those things themselves. At the same time, working side by side with neighbors that they haven't really talked to for many, that they haven't really talked to. These all leads to what we call compound outcomes in multiple areas. So it's not a mutually exclusive conversation, and for us, that is actually quite fundamental to building these kinds of participatory social infrastructure. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Karen. And Sue, please.
Can we reconcile health, happiness, and sustainability? I agree, in short, yes. The question about density in particular, is that in conflict with well-being? And I don't think so. Karen mentioned, tall buildings, people living in towers, and that could be in conflict with well-being. I think there's extra challenges there, but density doesn't mean you have to go to super tall towers. There is smart density too, and there's a huge missing middle. Lots of very dense cities have maximum, mid-rise. So these do not need to be in conflict whatsoever. In terms of consumption and growth meaning less well-being, that makes sense to me, like up to a point. Like having more stuff isn't going to make you happy. I think what everybody's saying is that it's those non-material things that matter more. Once you have a house or whatever, your basic needs, what's more important is your sense of purpose, respect, and connection, dignity. These are the things that matter the most. So.
Thank you, Sue. And then we'll go Paul first, then Gaynor, and then I will hand it back to Jennifer to thank everyone and close our session. But before we do that, I will take the opportunity to say thank you to each of you, and particularly for the brilliant presentations. So Paul, please.
Thank you very much, Val. And yes, I'm also going to agree that the holy trifecta, well-being, health, and sustainability is indeed achievable. And you see that in these sort of rich, healthy, happy, but also increasingly sustainable cities in Northern Europe, but also in Canada and also in other parts of the rich world. So I would say that a lot of, as it were, the new movement in highly developed countries is exactly towards improvements on all these three things. And that also includes reduced air pollution, cleaning up the cars, as it were, killing the cars locally, as Stefano would like to call it, definitely. When one is thinking about the world correlation, then I think one is talking about the short and medium run trade-offs that there are when poor countries become median income countries. That is where we indeed see that economic growth, which comes with health improvements, comes at the cost of well-being, and certainly comes at the cost of the environment. So there we see large trade-offs. But they are short to medium run trade-offs because there's a kind of a Kuznets curve, as economists say, which means that things get worse for the environment the first 10, 20 years of development, and then things turn up again. And in the longer run, I think that is the only way in which we can move. So yes, it's possible, but there is a short to medium run cost when it comes to low levels of development.
And finally, Gaynor, please.
Yeah, very quickly, I would also be a yes. A couple of things. I think just back to some earlier comments, I think we do need, at least in a country like Canada, enabling federal policy landscapes and federal legislation, and not disabling or policy that's in the way from the federal government and higher levels of government. I think that's important. I also would say that of the three, health, happiness, and sustainability, as a physician, I actually would not advocate for leading with health, because certainly in the Canadian context, that creates a large sucking sound towards a healthcare system, which I think is the opposite of what creates healthy communities, actually. So if I was going to lead, I would lead with happiness and sustainability. I have confidence that health will follow if you create those two.
Great, thanks. And we'll ask Jennifer to close out for us. Thanks,
Sure.
everyone.
Thank you. I love that closing clip. That's fantastic. Your last words there, Gaynor, I think are very, very inspiring and help us to think about, rethink about where we're headed. So I just want to thank the panelists, thank Val. It was a fantastic conversation. It was so interesting. and such an interesting exchange of, you know, bringing in the research and the policy and the reality in the Canadian context. So we're ending the session here. Many of you have participated in 2 sessions. Thank you so much for coming. There has been some lively discussion in some of the forums on the site that I think you'll see some sharing of resources. Somebody started a kind of a special group looking at environment and well-being. The conference site will stay open for the duration of the conference, and so you can come in anytime if you want to exchange with others on any questions. And otherwise, I hope that you're all able to join us on May 28th, the closing conference session. There'll be some great keynotes and a really exciting closing panel to really move forward more on this thinking of where do we go from here with wellbeing policy in Canada. So thank you, everyone. Be good and take care of one another. Best.